Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the new album from Foxes, the debut album titled Glorious. Now, when I make my year-end list of the top 10 best hit songs of the year, I always make a point of taking a look at what other critics tend to hold up as their favorites across this particular category. And while there are certain songs that will inevitably cross multiple lists, including mine, there was one that I couldn't in good faith put on my list. Clarity by Zedd. Now, many critics consider it to be one of their favorite mainstream EDM songs to chart, and I definitely understand why. It had a solid crescendo, a great backing chorus, and lyrics that managed to fit the broad scope of the song. And yet, I was never a really big fan of that track in comparison with songs like Wake Me Up by Avicii and Don't You Worry Child by Swedish House Mafia. I found the beat to be a little bit underweight, the synthesizer line to be a little bit overstuffed, and the melody line not all that impressive. It just didn't go anywhere for me. However, there was one person on that song that did stand out for many people, including myself, and that was Foxes, a British pop singer-songwriter whose soulful delivery and very careful balance between ethereal distance and raw vulnerability really anchored and humanized that song. Now, I was more familiar with her from Just One Yesterday, a song off of Fall Out Boy's gloriously messy album Save Rock and Roll. And if it wasn't for a few sloppy rhymes in the verses courtesy of Pete Wentz, it would have made one of my other year-end lists simply on atmospheric power, interplay, and drama alone. And as such, I was interested to see where Foxes would take her debut album Glorious, because to be fair, I didn't have much of a grasp on her musical identity outside of her featuring credits. What was this new album going to deliver? What was it going to be about? What was Foxes going to bring to the table here? Well, I can say this. You all know those young adult dystopian novels that are all getting made into movies right about now? If any writer slash director wanted to add some real teeth to these films and go for a real bleak downer ending where maybe the bad guys win or everybody dies, I would hire Foxes immediately for your soundtrack, because Glorious is an album that could easily fit as a soundtrack to one of those films in a heartbeat. The title of this record is something of a contradiction in that it's both completely apt in describing the sound, but a little bit disproportionate when it comes to the subject matter, at least on parts of this album. Now, I'll get into this further, but let's get the basic question out of the way. Is this album any good? Well, yeah, it's really good, but I'm not quite sure it's great or entirely earns the drama that it's trying to evoke on all of its songs. Okay, to explain this, we need to start with Foxes herself, who really does way more than anybody else to sell this record in her performance. This woman is a gifted singer with a ton of natural talent, a killer emotional delivery, and enough power to really sell the dramatic stakes of these songs. You can tell she's really trying hard here. An interesting comparison with Foxes is Licky Lee, as they both address similar subject matter, especially off of Licky Lee's most recent album, but while Licky Lee has more restraint and control in her dramatic emotions, Foxes is much more expressive, but a lot less subtle. It makes her a great fit for dance songs with a darker edge like Night Owl's Early Birds and the great song Let Go for Tonight, but I'm not sure it's the best fit for the slew of breakup songs that pepper this album. I don't deny that they work on a very visceral, vulnerable, emotional level, but as the album does go on, it begins to come across a little bit limited, at least in her emotional range and delivery on these songs. Now, what definitely isn't limited is the instrumentation and production, which is probably my favorite part of this album, drawing on both minimalist and dark indie pop and blending it with EDM swell and raw bombast. And honestly, it's a great fit. The drums and percussion have a ton of energy and texture while rarely drowning out the melody line. The ghostly electronic effects rarely feel out of place. The strings accompaniment slide in and out effortlessly. And outside of a few moments where Fox's vocal track sounds a little bit quiet throughout the mix, the production is excellent. I love the off-kilter twinkling and holding on to heaven, especially when the song kicks into a bit of a quicker tempo. I really dig the slow rumbling pulse of the beat in White Coats, balanced out with the occasional thin jet of fuzz. I love the thick drums on Night Owl's Early Birds. And you know what? Pretty much whenever a piano line comes into this album, it just works for me. I can't say anything else. Now, I won't say all of the synth choices win me over. The opening track, Talking to Ghosts, has a synth line that feels a little too nasal for my taste, and in Shaking Heads, it's a little bit too clattering to blend well with the smoother production. But honestly, for the most part, the instrumentation and production on this album just really do work for me. So some of you are asking, okay, why doesn't he love this album? Well, now we come to the songwriting, and look, It's her debut album, and these sorts of records always need a little bit more time to establish some sort of momentum when it comes to songwriting. But even on that standard, the songwriting is pretty far from great on this album, especially on a very, very technical level. Now, to give credit to Foxes, it's easy to overlook these mistakes because her voice has such a natural flow from line to line. But look, we don't live in a world where heavy rhymes with severed, and that's just one example across this album. But you know what, that's nitpicking. What's the bigger picture on this record? Well, for one, this album should not be read as a coherent album statement in any form, and should be viewed more as a collection of singles. And you know what? On that level, it kind of works pretty damn well. And I'm not going to judge the album negatively on that factor. But at the same time, it's also an album that really only has two types of songs on it. The young, wild and free, quasi-empowerment but not really sort of song, and the breakup track. And you know what? In the first camp, Foxes does bring a little bit more variety and nuance, pointing out that some of these situations are a ton of exuberant fun, but they have their darker underside. And her delivery really does emphasize the desperate recklessness of youth trying to hold on to their freedom in an increasingly hostile world. As I said, perfect for dystopia movies. But in the breakup song territory, it quickly becomes apparent that outside of the occasional pretty description and Fox's great performance behind the microphone, there isn't a lot to these songs. Talking to Ghost and Echo are pretty much the exact same type of song, a barely holding it together breakup track, and Holding On to Heaven and Count the Saints aren't far removed from that either. Both describing relationships that Foxes knows aren't great, but she's still head over heels of the guy in question. But that's the limit of lyrical nuance that we're getting on this album. There are several pretty turns of phrase that I did like, but there's not a lot else. There's not a lot below the surface here. Now, granted, it's pop music, and you can typically get away with that, but I don't know, I think I was expecting more here. And combined with Fox's very potent but not particularly complex delivery, there are several songs that can come across as really melodramatic, which is not a good sign when Foxes is clearly taking this album so seriously. Maybe a broader emotional range here could have helped with a little bit more variety in songwriting topics, but when the nuance in the songwriting just isn't here, the songs can come across as a little bit adolescent, which might have been her intention and will certainly resonate with the teenage boys and girls everywhere. As I said, works for dystopia stuff, but outside of that, it doesn't really click with me. But you know what? In the end, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy this album. I've always liked bombast in a pop sense in this vein, and when Foxes really kicks things into a quicker, danceable tempo, she does deliver some stellar pop songs. But outside of her delivery, I'm not exactly in love with her songwriting, especially on the breakup tracks. Now, granted, as I said, it's pop music. I'm not expecting huge amounts of nuance or wit, but there is definitely room for improvement here. So, with all that in mind, and keeping in mind the fact that this is a debut album, I'm giving Foxes Glorious a 7 out of 10 and a definite recommendation, especially if you're a fan of bombastic, almost epic British pop music. But as for me, I like to see Foxes push her boundaries a little bit further. I like that desperate youth rebellion inspired tracks. That's a niche she could easily slot herself into, and they show a lot of promise here. So if you're hunting for that sort of song, or you're a teenage guy and you're just looking for an overwrought breakup track, Foxes does deliver, so check her out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming up that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Just a warning though, my work schedule is actually going to pick up coming for the next 6 months, so I'm going to have to be a little bit more selective with my album reviews, so just keep that in mind when you're putting out selections, especially if they're not from this year. So until then, my name's Mark, you've all been watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.